Good morning. My name is Jill Flessing, and I serve as the chair of the Addiction Counselor Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Denise Sisman,
Present.
Christina Boyd, and Lisa Carter said she wasn't going to be here. Jason Grieber,
Present.
Chad Jacobs,
Yeah.
Michael James, who's just logging in. Charity Cosson,
Present.
Crystal Norman,
Present.
Dulcinea Rakestraw,
Present.
Judy Roycer,
Present.
and Zenova Williams.
Present.
I note the following BSRB staff members are also present: David Fye
Here.
and Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Jill. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about any concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the Executive Director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested time for public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended. Therefore, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On December 18th, 2024, we sent notice to the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of such meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line "request for the agenda," and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of this meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I did check the conference call line before we got started. It is active, but no one is on the line. If I hear someone beep over and introduce themselves, I will let you know.
The meeting is now called to order, and the first item on the agenda is agenda approval. Everyone should have received an email from David with materials attached, one of which is the agenda for today. And I would the committee be willing to approve the agenda for today? Did I get a motion to approve the agenda?
I'll motion to approve.
I'll second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed, same sign. Okay. David noted there was no public comment requested for today. So the next item on the agenda is review and approval of minutes of the previous meeting, which was also in the email in the attachments. If you've gotten a chance to briefly look at those, may I get a motion to approve the previous meeting minutes?
I move to approve the previous meeting minutes.
I second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed, same sign. Thank you. Agenda has been approved and minutes of the last meeting have been approved. Now, Executive Director report. I'll turn that over to David.
All right, thank you, Jill. We'll start with some updates from BSRB operations, and then we'll move to a couple legislative items, and then some updates from the most recent board meetings. So first, we'll start with some operations updates. I want to thank all of you for responding to the survey that we had sent out to licensees. This was a big undertaking, but I was very pleased with how things turned out. We were originally planning to hold the survey open for a couple weeks, and we ended up holding it open for about a full month, just to make sure that we gave everyone the opportunity to provide responses. Staff members now and also myself, we're going through a lot of that information and trying to put it all together in a way that we can digest a lot of the helpful feedback that we received. Just as a reminder, these surveys basically started when we started to survey social workers. The Advisory Committee for Social Work a few years back had requested a survey of licensees in that area to look at certain information. And some of the topics they had explored in the past was, doing supervision by tele services versus in-person supervision, and trying to understand the profession a little bit better. Some of the things that they had surveyed their individual licensees about in the past had to do with continuing education, unprofessional conduct, and different standards like that. But last year, what we decided to do was we wanted to open this up for the other 6 professions regulated by the BSRB. And so we created lots of different types of surveys. I believe there were in total 13 different versions of the survey. And part of that was because we tried to have different questions for each level of licensure that were unique for a bachelor's level addiction counselor versus a clinical addiction counselor. But we also strived for uniformity. Once each of the advisory committees had given input towards questions, we wanted to seek to see, the clinical level of licensing. Could we find questions that were going to be similar so that we could do more of a comprehensive look back report and do some comparisons between professions? And so I think we were able to achieve both. I think there are some questions that are unique to certain professions, definitely some that are unique to certain license levels. And then we have some that kind of across the professions we were able to ask some questions about. So I really do appreciate everybody who filled those out and sent information back to us. Part of this, when we're doing this round of surveys, we've also been asked to look at trying to describe workforce a little bit better and trying to understand workforce in a changing environment. We have joined 3 multi-state compacts for professions regulated by the BSRB, SIPAC for the licensed psychologist or PhD level psychology profession, professional counseling multi-state compact for the professional counselors, and then most recently the social work multi-state compact. And as a lot of these compacts are getting to the point to where they're close to being operational, we're trying to redefine workforce. In the past, our best method of doing this was looking at licensure and looking to see how many individuals were licensed. Well, we know that there are individuals licensed in multiple states. That was one of the motivations for the compact, was to help out with practitioner mobility and also with client mobility and make sure the continuation of care was achieved. But we're also trying to understand, in a changing environment post the pandemic, how much of the services are being provided in person versus how much is being done through teleservices. And then how much are direct services with clients versus how much of a practitioner's day is overseeing the work of other people. And then we also asked a question that had to do with anticipated retirement in the profession. We know how many people are getting licensed and joining the profession, but being able to look ahead may be helpful in terms of preparing, in terms of helping individuals get into certain pathways and just kind of understanding things in the future. And so I really do appreciate all the work all the advisory committees put in terms of those survey questions. We have a lot of data. I can tell you just from beginning to sift through a lot of that information, people gave really thoughtful responses, and there's a lot there. And so we want to try to summarize that information, but we also want to include as much as possible the specific language used by individuals who filled out the surveys. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to have some sections that are summaries, or for multiple choices, we'll have some charts or graphs. And then in the backs of those reports, we will include appendices with most of the responses so that individuals can go and read through those. But there's a lot of information, but it's really good information. So just wanted to thank everybody for that. Second, I do want to make another continuing push for licensees to join and activate their account with the eBroker. We talked about this in the fall, and I'll continue to kind of reference it from time to time. We did do a partnership with the eBroker. They offer a service at no charge to the licensing board and no charge to licensees. but it's a really helpful service. It's the ability for licensees, when they finish their continuing education, the ability to upload their documentation of those hours. So that way they don't have to maintain it in paper form or, in their email or some other mechanism. There's a nice portal they can use for that. And an added benefit for that is 10% of licensees are audited upon renewal of their license. And if they are using CE Broker for that portal and we pull them for audit, instead of the traditional back and forth where they send us documentation, we review it. Instead, what we can do is we can log into the CE Broker portal. And if that information has been uploaded and if it's been assigned to certain categories, we can review that and it should complete the audit process much more quickly and it'll be more efficient. And so really encouraging more people to go ahead and activate their accounts if they haven't already. We know there have been some people who've done it. We've received some really positive feedback from licensees that they appreciate that being a service the board was able to offer to them. And so overall, we've seen really positive response to that, but we want to encourage more people to go ahead and sign up for that and continue to utilize their services. Moving next to some legislative items. So there's two main items that the BSRB is involved with during each legislative session. The first, as a state agency, we are required to submit a budget for each year. This year, we are in fiscal year 2025. That runs from July 1st of one year to June 30th of the following year. So we're in fiscal year 2025. And as it's known as a biennial agency in the legislative sense, we are supposed to make a budget request for 2 additional fiscal years. So when we brought forward our budget this year, we made adjustments to the existing year, fiscal year 25, and then a budget request for fiscal year 26 and fiscal year 27. This was back in September when we submitted this. Traditionally, what happens next is the governor's division of the budget reviews that information, works with agencies on any kind of request for additional funding or things like that. And then the first week of the legislative session, or usually the second week in January, the legislature or the governor comes out with a budget recommendation for every agency. And then the legislature works from that as a starting point, both the House and the Senate, and then they make further adjustments by agency. This year, the legislature was doing something different. They decided to explore a different process. And so agencies were still required to submit budgets by the middle of September or October 1st. And then while the governor did review those as is required by law, the legislature decided to hold a special committee in the fall and have that committee meet a few times to review agency budgets as a legislative body. And so the legislature did have that special committee meet. It made recommendations. And then when the legislative committees that review budgets started to meet in the spring, instead of using the governor's recommendation as the base, they used the special committee recommendations from the fall. And the House has a standing committee. Our budget was heard in the House Higher Education Budget Committee. They asked some questions and ultimately recommended the same amount that we had requested as a limit and how much we could spend for each fiscal year. So that moved to the House Appropriations Committee. There were no additional changes, and then that was included in the House's appropriations bill that was passed across the House floor a couple weeks ago. On the Senate side, as I mentioned, traditionally the House and the Senate review agency budgets simultaneously. Sometimes we attend meetings of Senate subcommittees of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. Sometimes those budgets are assigned to standing Senate committees. This year, the Senate took a different approach. They decided to wait for the House to pass the budget bill. And then rather than hear all agency budgets, they decided to identify budgets that they wanted to work on individually after the appropriations bill had been assigned to the Senate Ways and Means Committee. And so we are one of the smaller agencies in the state, and we also are an agency that doesn't request any money from the state general fund. And I've mentioned this a few times in the past, but by statute, a fee-funded agency like the BSRB actually contributes money back to the state general fund. 10% of our revenue that we receive, up to a cap of $100,000 per year, goes back to the state general fund to help fund other state operations. So when the House passed their appropriations bill and it was assigned to Senate Ways and Means Committee, I was informed about a week ago that the Senate will not be holding a specific budget hearing on the BSRB's budget at this point. So the House's position on the BSRB budget will move forward. If there's any recommendations by the Senate committee that would affect all agencies, sometimes they're called global. If it's a global, that potentially could affect the BSRB, depending upon the type of funding or whatever is in that global. But on a agency by agency basis, I think from what it sounds like right now, the intention is that our budget was probably done for the year. And so the good news is yeah, that was set at the amount that we had requested for limits. We did go ahead and take a conservative approach, in my opinion, to our budget. We came in about $40,000 under budget from what we had been approved for last year. And so we were trying to be good stewards of the money that's in our fee fund balance. And then there was a little bit of an increase in fiscal year 26 and 27, and most of that was due to anticipated inflationary costs. There's things that we just know are going to go up. Some of that is through the cost index that we can anticipate some changes there. But there's also increases in things like capers, employer contributions, or cost of rent, or even some things like, Office 365 accounts for staff. Some of the prices are always going to go up. So for the agency, I can tell you the amount of money in the agency's fee fund is right around $1.8 million. Our annual budget is about 1.2 million. So the budget is appropriate. In my opinion, the amount in the fee fund balance is going down by design based on fee decreases that were put in place a few years back. So we're in good shape financially, but I think this year the budget for the BSRB is probably at a good spot. In terms of other legislative items, it's interesting. I've been talking recently with some representatives from similar agencies in other states and asking them just for comparison about their legislative process. What I find is that in Kansas, it's a little bit unique compared to some other states. In some other states, they really lack the ability to provide testimony in most cases on legislation. In a lot of states, whatever the governor has directed agencies under the executive branch to do, that is the direction for the agency. And on some, they basically take the position that they're able to inform. So maybe the board can provide neutral testimony, but they're not able to advocate for one thing or another. So the rules are a little bit different here in Kansas. The board is able to make recommendations and requested changes to request a bill. And so the board did request some changes in legislation this year, unfortunately, due to a couple of technical issues behind the scenes, mostly involving the number of bill requests made to the Reviser of Statutes office. The draft for the BSRB bill was not available to be introduced in committees until that process was nearly complete. And so by the time we were able to make a request to have it introduced in the House Committee of Social Services, it was too late for it to be introduced. There was a deadline where we couldn't introduce the bill in that committee any longer. We made a request to see if it could be introduced in an exempt committee like House Appropriations, but unfortunately we weren't able to have that approved to be introduced in that committee. So I reached out to a contact on the Senate side to see if it could be introduced in the Senate, Senate exempt committee. And I think there was some support for that, but I have not heard that it was actually, that there would be an introduction this year. So I think at this point, unfortunately, given logistics, I don't think the bill is going to be able to go forward this year. Even if it was introduced in the Senate at this point, the amount of time needed for it to receive a hearing, to be passed by the Senate floor, then be assigned over to the House to receive a hearing, to be passed on the House floor, I just think we're just going to run out of time. So unfortunately, this has not happened in my experience working with the legislative staff in the past, but I think due to the number of bills they were assigned, it unfortunately just kind of got caught. So I think these items will be carried forward and we'll be able to introduce the bill next year. But I think in terms of those items passing by the legislature this year, I think unfortunately that is looking very unlikely to happen. So,
David, does that include the recommendation this committee made to the board about student temporary licensure?
it does, yeah. We were hoping to expand the groups of individuals who could qualify for the student temporary licenses for addiction counseling. And unfortunately, that looks like it won't be able to move forward this session. So we'll just have to continue to support that and try to get that through next session. But I am optimistic this is sort of a one-year bump. I don't anticipate this being a continuing issue. The actual draft of the legislation is complete. As it's ready to be introduced. It's just more of a timing thing at this point. So it probably would be better, honestly, I think, for us to introduce it next session, because then it'll be ready to be assigned to different committees. So, but just wanted to provide an update on those items. Unfortunately, it looks like we won't go forward with those items this year. Moving and then last to just some items from the most recent board meeting. The board has met a couple of times. Most recently, the board had a special meeting, and that was mostly to receive some legal advice from counsel. There have been a few bills that have passed this session, and the board wanted to meet to receive some information that was suitable to be received through attorney-client privilege. So there was a special board meeting in February, but most of that information was in a confidential session between the board and legal counsel. The board did have a full meeting at January 13th on a Monday, and just a couple items from that meeting. There was public comment from a representative from the Kansas Art Therapy Association. They were seeking licensure for art therapists this session. That bill was introduced, but it didn't receive a hearing, so I don't anticipate that bill going forward this session. There was also some information from Jason Hess, who serves as the board's appointee to the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board. That's a group that was created about 3 years ago, and it oversees a lot of the money that the state of Kansas receives from federal litigation involving opioids. And they work with different entities. There's about maybe 10 to 12 appointees, and they award out grants to for-profit and nonprofit entities that are providing addiction type services. So if you want to hear a little bit more about the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board, that January board meeting would be a good one to check out. Additionally, there was some language that we had proposed to the board concerning an expedited application process. We were asked to go ahead and put forward a version of this for licenses under the BSRB, but without a lot of information to guide that process. We looked at what other agencies are doing in the state, and really we didn't see a comparable program that we could build from. We also reached out to other entities in different states, and there really wasn't a comparable program to build from there either that we could identify. So we did create some language that we proposed to the board, and the board was receptive of that language. So we're going to have that available for the board in the form of a regulation that can be approved, or at least discussed by the board at the next board meeting. There was also a couple of recommendations from the master's level and licensed psychology advisory committees for psychology. This had to do with modifying their definitions of in residence concerning their educational regulations to make those more in sync with the recent changes for the professions under the BSRB. So what they, in a big picture sense, what they were doing, they currently have the former definition of in residence in their regulations, but that definition means something different and for the professions than it currently does in psychology. So they are removing that definition from their regulation, and they are setting specific language in the regulations to really indicate which courses would need to be obtained while in the physical presence of the instructors versus which ones could be by face-to-face synchronous contact. And so that matches more cleanly the regulation changes a lot of professions made about a year ago. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up my report and see if there's any questions over the operations, legislative items from board meetings, or anything else any individuals have questions about.
Okay. If there are no questions, we'll move on to old business on the agenda. Old business is continued discussion on regulation of artificial intelligence. It is my understanding that this agenda item today is to be an opening of a discussion. We're not particularly looking to make any recommendations to the board at this time. And I really wanted to see folks' thoughts, if they're using AI, how they're using AI. I know there were a couple attachments in the materials David sent for today's meeting. David, I wonder if you could frame this a little bit more as you are in all the advisory committee meetings.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So basically the board and in a lot of other states, similar licensing boards are all wrestling with the topic of how to regulate artificial intelligence. and how to approach this topic, because it is a little bit intimidating from the outside, and it's definitely an area that is still evolving. And so I thought might be helpful for you would be to provide some different documents that we are seeing here at the office. We are continuing to collect information, and we're hoping to put together, I don't know if I'd say a library of information, but some helpful resources so that you can kind of see the approaches that different people are taking to that information. So in your packet of material, I included 3 handouts. One has to do with a document that is titled Generative Artificial Intelligence Policy, and it is dated July 31st of 2023. And the reason I wanted to include this document for you, so as a state agency, we fall under the executive authority in the state of Kansas, and we receive our services for IT through the Office of Information Technology Services. We sometimes refer to them as OITS. And what they gave us about a couple of years ago was a policy that was meaning to outline the acceptable use of generative artificial intelligence for state agencies. And the effort here was to protect the safety, privacy, and intellectual property rights of the state of Kansas. And what this policy talked about was that there were a lot of artificial intelligence tools that were out there, and I think they had been receiving some questions as far as what agencies could use. They did say that there is some value to some of the technology, but there's also potential risk that could include inaccuracies, bias, and potentially unauthorized use of certain intellectual property. So what they did is they issued this, and they asked all states to consider this when using or when thinking about using artificial intelligence. Some of that information talks about what is restricted and what we are unable to use. And then part of the document also goes into, if you are using certain things, you need to make sure that you're not using it as a substitution, that you're using this as a tool. But there's a section that says 9.2.2. It says responses generated from generative AI shall not be used verbatim, be assumed to be truthful, critical, or accurate, be treated as a sole source of reference, be used to issue official statements, be solely relied upon for making final decisions, or be used to impersonate individuals or organizations. And then as you go on throughout the document, it talks a little bit more about some of the copyrighted information. So I think there's a realization that there are individuals and organizations out there that are using AI, but they wanted to make sure to put out some guidelines and some requirements that if you are using certain tools, you know that it needs to meet these requirements issued by OITS and Department of Administration, and ultimately the governor's office. So I want to make you aware of what, as a state agency, what we are being held to. And then second, you have a document that is titled Supporting the Safe and Ethical Use of AI in Mental Health Counseling. And that is from the American Association of State Counseling Boards. And I realize this is a different profession, but I think there's enough common ground here that this document is going to be helpful as well. It really does focus on the role of state licensing boards and mental health. It does say mental health counseling, but I think you're going to extrapolate over to addiction counseling. And that is to safeguard the public by ensuring that licensed professionals meet the minimum standard qualifications necessary for safe and ethical practice. They talk a little bit about ensuring the safety, privacy of some of the therapeutic relationship here. They talk a little bit about some of the tools that may be used, some of the guidance for boards as boards navigate how licensees should be using or maybe should not be using AI in terms of clinical practice. They provide some additional links to resources here for different boards in terms of the ethical use of AI. And then note that licensees should use great caution when considering using AI tools in crisis management care. And then there's an appendix here. One of the things that they touched upon was making sure that there is an informed consent. So if you are using certain tools, that you are making clients aware that you're using those tools. And so they have an appendix that's involved and informed consent for mental health counseling with AI support. That was kind of helpful to be able to look through some of these things. Some of the other items they want you to think about is things like data collection, secure storage, access control, retention policies, accuracy, and how much you are depending upon some of those things. And then they proposed here some rights where you have the ability to opt out and you have the right to decline the use of AI tools in your care. That was kind of interesting. And then, like I said, this is an informed consent. So you would need to find at the bottom there. But this is an example of something that could be used in terms of informed consent for mental health counseling. So I thought that was a helpful document. It's short. It's only about 6 pages long, but I thought you might benefit from seeing that. And then the last document that I attached, it is a lengthier report, about 76 pages. And this is a template and guidance document called Developing Artificial Intelligence Policies for Public Health Organizations. And there are a few different individual groups that worked on this, but some of them included the Kansas Health Institute and Wichita State University. And this was a recent document. It was put out just in January of 2025. If you go to the website for the Kansas Health Institute, there's some links to some additional resources as well. And I believe they've done at least one webinar to kind of go through some of this information as well. But it talks about, how to approach developing artificial intelligence policies for public health organizations. This is meant to be sort of a template and a guide for individuals when they are doing that. And so as we kind of talked about with the other materials, some of the main takeaway points are talking about things like data privacy, human oversight, the level of transparency, community engagement, and then training and capacity. And so I thought this would be a really helpful document for you to take a look at as you review these materials and have an informed discussion on this topic. I know there are definitely a lot more materials out there that are addressing the use of AI. I know that there have been some concerns about the use of certain items like ChatGPT. And recently I did hear about, I believe it was called ChatGPT for Government. And I haven't had a chance to really look into exactly what that is or how that works. But, clearly the concerns are being heard. And as I mentioned, this is a topic that is continuing to evolve. But I thought I'd just provide these to you now and ask that you take a look at them between now and the next meeting. And as Jill said, this is a topic that is going to continue to evolve. I think ultimately what the board of the BSRB would like is for each of the advisory committees to have good, productive discussions on this topic. And then ultimately, if you could make recommendations back to the board, recommending how the board could approach this topic, either from looking at certain type of artificial intelligence tools that would be acceptable or not, or perhaps the use of certain tools, or perhaps some recommended standards in terms of ensuring client confidentiality and privacy in certain ways. So anyway, I wanted to provide this information to you, and maybe I'll just go ahead and stop here and open it up for discussion or questions, and see if you have any questions about these documents or any discussion or takeaways for today. So.
Thank you for providing the additional information, and I just wanted to, of course, open the floor for discussion. I personally feel like I would need way more information about how AI was being used in practice before I could make any informed recommendation. But I wonder what y'all's thoughts are. Some of you are educators, some of you are supervisors, clinicians. What are your thoughts about? My understanding is that AI is out there and people are using it, because my initial reaction was like, just don't do it. But that apparently is a little bit old school. So what are you all encountering?
This is a pretty timely discussion. I actually sat in with one of the companies that produces the electronic health records. and what their AI integrations were. And some of the things that came up were, the word concern from that was the way AI works with the integration into this EHR, and I assume the way that's, I mean, it's an inevitability that it's going to be integrated into all the EHRs that the organization and individuals are using. But with the demonstration that we were provided showed the recording of a session with the client that then generates a transcript, and that the transcript AI can then produce a clinical note from the transcript. But some of the concerns are, to me, what happens with that recording? How long is that recording held? Is that recording an official part of the client's clinical file? And then how is that, again, how long is it maintained, and then how is it deleted so that there's no further access to the transcript? And of course, it becomes concerning, with that in existence, is that transcript then becomes subject to subpoena or to review by the courts. Another function that it had in the demo that we looked at that was impressive to me was that entities have the ability to make a requirement that a specific percentage of words be changed into the final documentation from what is generated by the artificial intelligence. So the clinical note is populated through AI, but then the system is able to monitor, did the clinician utilizing this directly use all the verbiage from what was generated, or what percent was changed. And so I thought that was a meaningful thing to have, to indicate that human eyes are upon it, and that the changes are being made, and we're just not accepting what's being produced. That's my input from what little I know.
I like that piece for sure. I know in education, it's colleagues still continue to go back and forth. About half of them are like, don't use it. I'm like, they're going to use it anyway. So how do we put it as a tool? And I think that percentage idea with what's changed is a good idea. Definitely from students. Client-wise, at this point, the only thing I probably would use it for would be assistance in creating forms and stuff that's not going to be directly with the client, but for more easily professional wording kind of thing, and then review. But the idea of it creating the progress note is extremely tempting. So I think clinicians will probably buy into that and take it on relatively quickly. So the privacy laws and how they apply to this definitely need lots of discussion.
And Michael, I'll add to just follow up on that. Not only is a plan in the near future, by summer at least, with the company that we spoke with, to have it be able to do the individual therapy sessions, but also to be able to do group therapy, to be able to audit a group therapy session and then generate group notes and individual notes from that, and to assist in treatment planning, so that AI would then be able to generate the treatment plan. So.
I would add, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I would just add in terms of like what Michael was saying in terms of in education. And so we definitely are in those conversations about how students, specifically like for their papers and assignments and things like that, are using AI, and kind of what our statement is as an individual professor versus like at a department, and also potentially what our university might want our statements to be, or whatever recourse that might look like, because that does start to be like academic misconduct. And so we're trying to figure out those things. But I mean, it is here, it's coming. We all use it probably already in ways that we may not even think about. But in terms of for our students in terms of our addictions counseling students and our students in internship and practicum, I do want to be aware of like what their sites are doing to try to see what's happening for them, as well as how we need to incorporate that into our curriculum of like how, like, especially like for our ethics course, because I teach the ethics course. I want to think about like what are things I need to bring up to students for this, because I did start hearing that agencies were using it for sometimes their own meetings. They would use the AI to be able to keep those notes. But then I also did hear about writing clinical notes. It's interesting to hear about the group therapy, that it could, maybe track different things. And I do have the same concerns or thoughts about the EHR and how that goes in and the legal ramifications. But I did also hear that the AI could be used to help diagnose. And that was something that was like a little bit interesting, of like, again, if persons, if human eyes are on it and they are reviewing it to check, it could be really helpful in terms of like, you may have missed something. They can give you a range of different diagnoses that you could be seeing. But also that could be not necessarily the best if you think like, oh, well, I wasn't thinking this and now I'm thinking this random thing because they said they talk to God, but it could just be a religious thing that they're talking about, necessarily that they have like psychosis or something. Then are the people trained enough, or well enough trained to be able to discern like what this is and why, or even just to go back and do more screening and assessments, or even referrals or something like that. So yeah, I would love to hear about other people's experience, especially clinically, or other thoughts.
Primarily in medical settings, and yeah, AI is already being used for notes by physicians every day. So there are products that are part of EHRs that I would assume must be HIPAA compliant. I don't know about 42 CFR in order to do that, right? In order to generate those notes. We talk a lot with our students and residents about reviewing those, right? Like, and that's really the overall catch with all AI, is that you should only use it for something you could do yourself if given enough time, right? Like, you shouldn't use AI as a tool for something that you don't have expertise in, but that it can be a tool for something that you could do if you had enough time. And so with that expertise that you have, you should be able to review your notes, even if they were generated by AI, in order to make sure that they are accurate, the same that you would any other kind of documentation that you would have it help you assist with, that you have to review it, because AI can just make things up. It is known to hallucinate. So not only to bring in bad information, but to totally hallucinate based off of what it potentially thinks you want it to generate. So you have to review it. And that when we're using these tools, right, that there still has to be that review, and your license is still the one on the line signing these documents. I think it's incredible how much it can help with treatment planning, not necessarily writing the whole thing, but coming up with those goals, putting them into words that are smart, right? That we, lots of times in my years of working in the field, we had banks of what different treatment plan goals would be, right? And we'd go back and look at those banks of what we used for other people. This is similar, right? Like it's the similar kind of bank that you're using, and just doing it in a slightly different and potentially more efficient way than searching through my old Word documents of those things to see what best fits this client. Same with diagnosing. There are a lot of tools available, but it has to be something that you have the expertise to diagnose with in the first place, right? So you would say, I sat with this patient, right? I sat with this person. I heard these things. Here's, some potential differential diagnosis that I could utilize. What makes sense, what doesn't, based off of my experience. There are some things, right, that you could cross out and be like, nope, that doesn't fit, because I know I have all of this other information outside of potentially what I had from this one meeting or this one bit of information. I think it's just really critical that people aren't using things like ChatGPT that put that information out for everywhere, right? That are the open source. But how are they using things that are closed source, that their information they're sharing isn't going out beyond that? And very clearly not putting any patient identifying information in.
Definitely that piece. I think the benefit that I don't want to overlook of the caution with the ethics and all that piece would be, as a provider, we all have our niche. We all have the places that we tend to go to. And I could see the diagnostic piece. I'd like to think it's a little bit harder to do in the mental health world, but I'm sure it is. I know AI has definitely assisted in medical world and not pigeonholing the problem here when it really is over here. Because the provider just didn't think about it, right? It's not exactly their scope or what they usually do. So maybe it would assist in, identification of a traumatic type of diagnostic versus a bipolar diagnostic or something like that, which often get confused. So I don't know. It's definitely a challenge, and I think we're gonna have to figure it out. And I'm guessing that there should be some training on understanding what AI does. That may be where we have our back end from a board standpoint of going, we're telling them they have to understand how these things work, at least a little bit. Like you said, closed source versus open source. I would not use ChatGPT for something like anything related to the chart or charting or clients or any of that kind of stuff, because it just adds all of your information to their database.
And Mike, to that point concerning understanding how the AI works, I do want to highlight a meeting for all of you. I believe it was at the this must have been at the December advisory committee meeting for marriage and family therapy. They had a guest presenter who was able to do a presentation on artificial intelligence, specifically as it connects to mental health professions. And I found that to be really interesting. And the behavior analyst advisory committee actually watched part of that presentation during one of their advisory committee meetings. We were able to do sort of a screen in a screen. But if you want more information on that, that would be another resource for anybody here. That meeting was on Friday, December 13th. And since all the meetings for the BSRB are broadcast, you could go to the YouTube channel and just find the link to that, or you could go to the agenda for that meeting and just click straight through on the YouTube link there. But there was a nice presentation on that December 13th meeting for the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee in terms of a speaker who was talking about AI and technology as it relates to mental health professions.
So clearly it is being used, and there's a lot of gray area that is yet to be really kind of nailed down or finalized. I know I have a lot of questions about informed consent of the client and if it's recording. And again, open source, closed source. So I would, I don't know, suggest that we table this conversation as this is evolving. I don't know, David, is it out of thought for this advisory committee to watch that presentation together?
Well, that's one thing that we could do at the next advisory committee meeting if we wanted to. We could schedule time and just kind of watch that together and then have a discussion about it afterwards if that would be good.
What do folks think about that? Okay, I see people nodding.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful.
I'm just curious, David, that presentation, is that a presentation is it just strictly factual presentation, or is it a presentation by someone who's advocating for the use of AI, or is it someone who is warning of the risks of AI?
It was not from if I recall correctly, I don't believe it was somebody associated with the company that was promoting AI. It was more from an educational type perspective, talking about sort of how the technology is currently working, and then some things to consider as it relates to all of this. So, yeah, let's see. The presenter might be able to reference his name here. Okay, so at that presentation, okay, it was actually, I was mistaken. This was at the October 11th meeting. But his name is Dr. Ben Caldwell. And there is a PDF copy of his presentation that's posted on the website as well. So that's on the October 11th meeting. But he put about 4 slides on each page. So probably, I would say, about 11 slides that he used for the presentation. If I recall correctly, I think the presentation was maybe about 30 minutes long or so. So that would fit nicely within a meeting. But he was talking about uh, essentially taking an approach at looking at artificial intelligence and mental health care, computing versus artificial intelligence, AI-based documentation, ethics related to AI and mental health care, conversational AI, what AI-based therapy is already in use, and then some thoughts on regulatory consideration. So
I certainly don't want to steal anyone else's work, but that may give us additional information within our field that could give us more of a starting place for conversation. And I appreciate the conversation here today. It's been informative for me.
David, have we seen any litigation yet? Do you know?
just
I
around
mean, maybe not in just in general, not just Kansas, because obviously, if there's been litigation, that's one place where those problems tend to go, hey, if you didn't think about me. So that would be one place I think we'd want to keep our eye out on.
that is true. I'll keep a heads up to see if I noticed any stories about litigation. Um, as an attorney, one of the things that has caught my attention, there is a pretty popular story about AI hallucinating, like Dulcinea was talking about, where I think an attorney used it for a brief, and I think some of it was probably pretty decent legal reasoning. And then at a certain point, apparently the AI just started making up citations and citing court cases that didn't exist. And so that's a lot of problems with that. And so familiar with some of those type stories, but I'll take a look and see if there's any litigation where they've looked into some of these topics as well.
Just had a question about and maybe people may know this or not, or how this might work. But in terms of like the recordings that happen for sessions, is it something is it always recording, or is it saying like, okay, now, like, how we do like an announcement, like we are now recording and now we're recording, so that things can be, on the record versus like off the record type of things? Is that something that happens, or people know anything about that?
I can just speak to the demos that I've seen, and yeah, you activate the recording and you end the recording.
I would have concerns with it doing group documentation and having other people's information in those group notes and recordings. And I know when I do text to talk, it gets it wrong most of the time. So how is it going to decipher who is speaking and make sure all of that is accurate and correct? I mean, there'd be a lot of data to sift through in a group session.
So I have heard a little bit about a technology that tries to identify a speaker, and it will identify this person when they're, now I guess there's lots of different types. So it may be that they try to identify one person based on their voice and assign them as person one. And you can go into the technology and relabel the person instead of person one as David Fye. And then person two, when they talk, it's this. And so I've heard there is some technology that can use that. And now if they get it wrong, they might take somebody's statement and put it under a different name. But I think that's how they were attempting to do that.
They were also using individual microphones per speaker, and so it identifies who is speaking based upon which microphone is picking it up.
I was thinking we used an owl camera for some of our board meetings, and we put that in the middle, and it does a nice job of highlighting who's speaking and talking. But we tend to use the owl for most of the audio pickup as opposed to individual microphones. And so it does a pretty good job of picking up who's talking and where it's going. But yeah, I'd be curious about that. I haven't tried to incorporate any of the AI tools myself, but we're all kind of learning about it right now, I think.
Zoom also has a pretty decent AI feature where this meeting, if it were being utilized by AI, it would generate a transcript for this meeting and would identify each speaker and then create summary notes and minutes or whatever else you need it to do on Zoom.
Yeah, we've had actually some internal conversations here about, what would be the appropriate use of AI. And since we have 7 different advisory committee meetings, and these are all public meetings, it's not confidential information that we're talking about here publicly. And so my staff members have asked me about, it would be okay to use AI to help them out with the notes and minute taking. And so we put together a list of different possible tools and then submitted those to OITS to review to see if they have any issue with us using any of those. So we're still waiting to hear back. But I know at least one thing that, what was crossed my mind is, one of the reasons I'm a little unusual because I like minutes. I enjoy the process of taking lots of information and making it succinct and digestible. So I appreciate that process, but it helps me remember what happens in these meetings a little bit better too, since there's 7 of them and the topics tend to be kind of similar. But also, I want my staff members to know what's going on with the different professions and to understand things. I want them to have a better level of, I want them to be invested in the work of the BSRB. And my concern is that if they're using a tool and there's too much reliance on the tool to do things that they would be doing themselves, would that mean that they're going to be less, they're going to be following the work of the different advisory committees less and be less connected to each of you and to the work of the board? And that's just something that, internally I'm wrestling with. And also kind of getting away from traditional practices, understanding you got to keep an open mind and be willing to adjust for change and new technologies. So on a personal level, I can add that to the discussion, is that that's a real practical application that we've had here.
Is this something we can continue to discuss in future meetings?
Yeah, there's no deadline for this really. I think this is more probably for this year. The advisory committees can have good discussions, and then maybe by the end of the year, if you're ready, maybe submit some recommendations back to the board for the board to attempt to tackle this topic.
Is that acceptable to everybody present? Okay, awesome. Okay, moving on to new business, and I am again going to ask David to frame this discussion. The first item under A is discussion on making up practicum hours for license.
Okay, thanks, Jill. And actually, I'm probably going to defer to Leslie Allen on this topic. She's the Assistant Director and Licensing Manager for the BSRB. And Leslie has had a lot of involvement with the different professions over the years. And she has worked with the BSRB from the entire time that addiction counseling was licensed, and even before that when it was registered. And so I think she has some thoughts about some of the unique aspects of how the language is concerning the practicum and the ability to make up hours if someone attends a program where the practicum includes fewer hours than what we need in our standards. So I'll turn it over to Leslie, and she can kind of go over some of the information that she and I were talking about, and then open it up for discussion as well.
Good morning. So in your education regulation, there's several things that a practicum has to include for it to meet the requirements, and one of those is an hour requirement for for the practicum for an LAC it's at least 400 clock hours of practice, and it has to have, supervision at a certain rate. And for the LMAC and LCAC, it's 300 hours of direct client contact in practicum in order to meet the requirements. The issue is that not everyone has those hour requirements met when they apply. So, for example, KCREP, accredited Council on Social Work, Council on accreditation for the professional counseling programs. They require 280 hours of direct client contact in their master's degree program. And we have had people who have graduated from one of those programs that had an addiction counseling focus, and they don't meet the hour requirement to become licensed as an LMAC. So my question to you or to the committee is that do you want to allow a workaround? For example, an LMFT, someone who applies for an LMFT can make up hours. If they don't have 300 hours of direct client contact, they can make up those hours before getting their full license. Your regulation does not include anything like that. And I wondered if it was something you would consider looking at to allow people to be able to get licensed without, going back to school and
Trying to find a school that would do that.
right. And it has to, in the regulation, the practicum has to be part of the program. So it has, it's a delicate balance.
Right. Leslie, and I've missed a number of meetings because of my teaching schedule, so this may have been conversated about. I know we had talked about if programs are NASAC accredited or KCREP accredited, that kind of stuff. It was just that kind of like checks a big box. Where did the practicum component fit?
So for NASAC accredited programs, they don't have to show that they met the hour requirement.
So then we would need to have that then.
No, so right now they either have to be NASAC accredited or they meet all the requirements. So it would just be programs that are not NASAC. And I don't know, your committee has never specifically said they want to include KCREP accreditation as a way to meet requirements, but that is something you could look at as well. But for the programs that don't hold either one of those, it would just, we have a provisional license that someone can get if they're just short of meeting requirements. They need a class or need practicum hours or something like that. They could get a provisional license and practice for a short time. It's usually not that many hours that they're needing. But then they could, within a year, they could make up those hours and then they could get a temporary or just take the exam and get their full license.
I guess my question is, or just my thoughts about it, is that, yeah, it would be pretty difficult, I think, if a student was not already one of our students and graduating from our program, because I believe we meet all the requirements, but
Right.
if they were trying to, if we're coming from another school and asking like, hey, can we join you all's practicum class? We would not allow that because we don't know them. We can't support that or any of those kind of things. And we've had students ask that before, and it's basically like you have to take our classes
Right.
to be able to do that. And so I just was wondering, what did those other licenses do? Do they just like earn them at their own employment, or do they have some kind of paperwork that I don't know how they earn those other hours, and if they can't do it necessarily at a academic program?
Well, if currently they would either have to get go to the board and the board would have to grant them authority to make up the hours, or they wouldn't be licensable. And so if the it has to be part of the school program and it has to be while they're in school, unless we give them authority either through the board or regulation that says they can do them postgraduate.
Okay. And then for the postgraduate, do they basically continue with their own school, I guess, or like work with them, or do they just like find a workplace that they can work with to get those extra hours?
It would be a work site. Once they've graduated from their program, then it would become through us. They would say, okay, I'm working here and I'm going to accrue these hours.
Is there a contract between their workplace and the BSRB that states that's what they're doing?
Well, we haven't had to do that. I mean, we could. I mean, we could draw something up. The one person who got licensed had to go to the board, which creates additional time and, you know, further time that they're not licensed. And they just have the order that says this is how many hours they have to do, and it has to be done at the same supervision ratio as in the regulation for practicum. So it's 1 hour of supervision for every 10 hours of client contact. So that would be written into the regulation. That's how they would have to make it up.
I'm not terribly informed on practicums outside of my own experience, having completed a couple of practicums and then supervising some practicums, but usually there's a learning contract with the practicums with the university that specifies some very concrete goals and objectives and tasks that are to be accomplished within that practicum. It's not, I don't think, terribly unlike a clinical supervision plan for advanced licensure, and so I'm wondering if there's a marriage of those two kind of ideas of developing a pretty specific practicum that would be done through a workplace with those kinds of learning goals and objectives and tasks. And then if so, if those would be standardized goals, or I think they usually relate back to the skills, objectives, and competencies. With in your academic language, so they can translate for me. So I don't know. It seems like it would be difficult to reach the same threshold that a college or a university is able to have, but maybe not insurmountable if they were going off of some sort of objective competencies that were being sought.
Well,
Right.
technically, and I would say technically they've already passed their educational part, so that wouldn't necessarily have to be like done in that way. They're mostly just doing their clinical supervision, so it's a bit less strenuous because the clinical education part is also supervised by our instructor as well, and so it's just like those hour requirements. But that's just how kind of we think about it and do it.
Right. It would not, I don't think it would be as rigorous as it would be if they were still in school. We have this, so for all the different, most of the different professions, if they didn't have a certain amount of direct client contact in their practicum, when they apply for clinical license, they've had to make up just the direct client contact hours in addition to the requirements for clinical license. So they do it with a training plan, which is for 2 years and, things like that. But it is not as detailed and rigorous as the practicum would have been in the program.
So Leslie, I'm just curious too. Do you have an idea about how many people we're talking about that would need this?
Just maybe a few a year. There's not a lot, but it really brought it to my attention when it was a K-CREP program, because that's considered quality education, and they can get licensure as a professional counselor, but then technically couldn't get licensed as an LAC or an LMAC. So it just seemed kind of unfair,
but they technically could go through like become an LPC and then get an LMAC.
They could.
But if they wanted to do the other way, they couldn't.
Right.
LMAC versus, well, yeah. of course
Right,
not.
yeah.
They
And
couldn't
this
get LMAC.
person wasn't
Interesting.
interested in getting their LP. I mean, they didn't apply for LPC yet. They just did their LMAC, so.
Interesting.
As hard as it is to get people in this field, I don't think we want to put up any more barriers than we have to. So if
That
there's
I thought.
a rate that allow them to do that, I think we should at least consider it.
I agree.
Okay. Then I'll work on some kind of language and get that drawn up and bring it back to you.
That would be great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your thoughtful solution thinking. Okay, moving on to future topics for the advisory committee in fiscal year 24 and 25. David, thoughts?
Sure. So, you know, as a group, this advisory committee works to assist the board in its public protection mission. And you all are really valuable to the board, and your conversations here are really helpful because you help bring one of the 7 professions in the perspective of licensees in that area. It helps to make sure that we're hearing from voices and hearing from experts in each of the different fields and having those recommendations forwarded back to the board. And so there are some standard things that we are doing with all the advisory committees. One of the ones last year was a survey. We also will routinely bring copies of your regulations back to you to review to see if there's any kind of updating that we can do. Make sure that we're being good stewards of those regulations. But we also have some flexibility here. If there's different topics that you as a profession would like to discuss, with the idea that this committee works in support of the board, but if you have recommended changes to the statutes or regulations for the profession or to any of the policies of the BSRB as it might relate to your profession, this could be a discussion point this year for any items to refer back to the board. And so just kind of wanted to, you know, we will bring things to you, but you can also originate things from the committee as well. So we normally do this on a year-to-year basis and just kind of see if there's any topics people want to focus on. Before I open it up and see if there's any particular items people have on the top of their head, I do want to mention that normally about this year, one of the topics we ask the advisory committee for input on is new advisory committee members. And we generally talk in the spring about, you know, would you like me to send a letter to all licensees that there's open positions on the advisory committee? At the moment, there are 0 open positions on the advisory committee, which I'm, you know, totally happy that we have such good members here that are all willing to volunteer their time. But that means that we normally wouldn't send that letter around for any individuals to join the advisory committee because we don't have any open spots. I did want to give you an update in terms of advisory committee members, though. There is 1 member who will reach the end of her 4th term next year and will have to come off the advisory committee at that time, and that is Dulcinea. And so she will come off the advisory committee at the end of June 2026, but at the end of June 2025, no individuals are scheduled to come off because of reaching the maximum length of service. So unless there's an advisory committee member who knows that they are not interested in seeking to be reappointed, then I'll just plan on not sending out that letter this year, and I'll just be ready to bring up this topic for all of you next spring, so we can talk about sending out a letter to licensees and letting them know that there will be an open position on the advisory committee. So. But if there's other topics that you'd like the advisory committee to look at, now one thing that I do also want to reframe, you know, one of the main differences between the regulatory board versus an association is that sometimes things that associations work on are more aspirational, or they do things and say, we encourage you to do this, or, you know, it would be good for you to do this. You should strive to do these things. Our role as a regulatory board is more about, what is legal and what is illegal or a violation. And so it's kind of when we talk about the unprofessional conduct standards and how they differ from maybe the ethics of an association. And an association may say, yes, you shouldn't do this, and we would agree that would also be a violation. But there may be some things where an association would say you should strive to publish or different things like that. Well, we're not going to penalize someone for not publishing. But there's a difference there. So while we do have some flexibility to talk about topics that we can work on, I do want you to keep in mind some of our limitations. If we're not able to require something in law, there's sort of a little bit of a gray area in terms of how much we can encourage people to do, because we don't want it to come across as blurring the lines between a requirement or not. So if it does start to get in that area, I'll just kind of highlight that for the committee and let you know. But I do think that there are some nice helpful grounds where the advisory committee could have some discussion. So I'll turn it over to all of you and see if there's any topics that you want to work on as an advisory committee this year. And also, one thing that's going to help our discussion on AI, and it may help our discussion in this area too, is I mentioned those surveys. And I think the next meeting, our hope, our plan is that those reports will be ready for the advisory committees to start reviewing at the next meeting. And we did include a couple of questions. One that talked about, are there additional ways in which the BSRB something along the lines of, are there additional ways the BSRB could be doing something different concerning protecting the public or something like that? And then I think there was a catch-all question that said, is there anything we didn't cover that you would like to provide to the BSRB for input? So maybe some of those fields for your profession could add to this discussion too. But like I said, you all are really valuable members of this group. And if you have thoughts yourself, we want to give you the opportunity to share those too. So.
This might be off topic a little bit, but a couple meetings ago we had discussed somehow coming up with a list of possible supervisors for the LCAC. Because I think like I know for myself, being in rural Southeast Kansas, there are just not a lot of, I don't know who can supervise and kind of what that looks like to become an LCAC. Do you remember that conversation?
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't know if we could revisit that somehow.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Are there other topics folks have been thinking about or want to bring to the next meeting? And David, I'm wondering if someone thinks of something going about their day, if they could email you.
Yes, that's probably a real good way to go ahead and handle that. If you do think of something between now and the next meeting, just send an email directly to me, and I will go ahead and add that to a list of discussion topics for the next meeting. And then when Jill and I meet to go over some items for the agenda, we can talk about those things. So if you do think of something between now and then, just shoot an email to me, and I'll go ahead and flag that for discussion.
Item 8 on the agenda is additional topics. Do we have any additional topics today? Okay. Anyone else have any other things to discuss? Okay. Looks like we're going to end early today. Our next meeting, as we meet quarterly, is scheduled to be in June. David, would you be willing to send out a poll to narrow down a date and a time?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay. The final item on the agenda is adjournment. Could I get a motion to adjourn the meeting?
A motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
All those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
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 Those opposed, same sign. Thank you all for your time today. I appreciate it a great deal. Have a good spring.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks, good to see y'all.
you.